The rules of the Death Note. Death Note. How to use it. The human whose name is written in this note shall die. This note will not take effect unless the writer has the person's face in their mind when writing his or her name. Therefore, people sharing the same name will not be affected. If the cause of death is written within 40 seconds of writing the person's name, it will happen. If the cause of death is not specified, the person will simply die of a heart attack. After writing the cause of death, details of the death should be written in the next 6 minutes and 40 seconds. His note shall become property of the human world once it touches the ground, after arriving in the human world. The owner of the note can recognize the image and voice of its original owner, i.e., a god of death. The human who uses this note can neither go to heaven nor hell. If the time of each death is written within 40 seconds after writing the cause of death as a heart attack, the time of death can be manipulated, and the time can go into effect within 4 seconds after writing a name. The human who touches the death note can recognize the image and voice of its original owner, a god of death, even if the human is not the owner of the note. The person in possession of the death note is possessed by a god of death, its original owner, until they die. If a human uses the note, a god of death usually appears in front of him or her within 39 days after he or she uses the note. Gods of death, the original owners of the death note, do not do in principle anything which will help or prevent the deaths in the note. A god of death has no obligation to completely explain how to use the note or rules which apply to the humans who own it. A god of death can extend his life by putting human names on the note, but humans cannot. A person can shorten his or her own life by using the note. The human who becomes the owner of the death note can, in exchange for half of his or her remaining life, get the eyeballs of the god of death, which will enable him or her to see a human's name and remaining lifetime when looking through them. A god of death cannot be killed even if stabbed in his heart with a knife or shot in the head with a gun. However, there are ways to kill a god of death which are not generally known to the gods of death. The conditions for death will not be realized unless it is physically possible for that human, or it is reasonably assumed to be carried out by the human. The specific scope of the condition for death is not known to the gods of death either, so you must examine and find out. One page taken from the death note, or even a fragment of the page, contains the full effects of the note. The instrument to write can be anything, e.g., cosmetics, blood, etc., as long as it can write directly onto the note and remain as legible letters. Even the original owners of the death note, gods of death, do not know much about the note. You may also write the cause and or details of death prior to filling in the name of the individual. Be sure to insert the name in front of the written cause of death. You have about 19 days according to the human calendar in order to fill in a name. Even if you do not actually possess the death note, the effect will be the same if you can recognize the person and his or her name to place in the blank. The death note will not affect those under 780 days old. The death note will be rendered useless if the victim's name is misspelled 4 times. Suicide is a valid cause of death. Basically, all humans are thought to possess the possibility to commit suicide. It is therefore not something unbelievable to think of. Whether the cause of the individual's death is either a suicide or accident, if the death leads to the death of more than the intended, the person will simply die of a heart attack. This to ensure that others' lives are not influenced. Even after the individual's name, the time of death, and death conditions on the death note were filled out, the time and condition of death can be altered as many times as you want, as long as it is changed within 6 minutes and 40 seconds from the time it was filled in. But, of course, this is only possible before the victim dies. Whenever you want to change anything written on the death note within 6 minutes and 40 seconds after you wrote, you must first rule out the characters you want to erase with 2 straight lines. As you see above, the time and conditions of death can be changed, but once the victim's name has been written, the individual's death can never be avoided. If you lose the death note or have it stolen, you will lose its ownership unless you retrieve it within 490 days. If you have traded the eye power of a god of death, you will lose the eye power as well as the memory of the death note once you lose its ownership. At the same time, the remaining half of your life will not be restored. You may lend the death note to another person while maintaining its ownership. Subletting it to yet another person is possible too. The borrower of the death note will not be followed by a god of death. The god of death always remains with the owner of the death note. Also, the borrower cannot trade the eyesight of the gods of death. When the owner of the death note dies while the note is being lent, its owner will be transferred to the person who is holding it at that time. If the death note is stolen and the owner is killed by the thief, its ownership will automatically be transferred to the thief. When the same name is written on more than 2 death notes, which the note which was first filled will take effect, regardless of the time of death. If writing the same name on more than 2 death notes is completed within a 1/6 of a second difference, it is regarded as simultaneous. The death note will not take effect and the individual will not die. The god of death must at least own 1 death note. The death note must never be lent to or written on by a human. Exchanging and writing on the death notes between gods of death is no problem. If the god of death decides to use the death note to kill the assassin of an individual he favors, the individual's lifespan will extend, but the god of death will die. The dead god of death will disappear, but the death note will remain. The ownership of this death note is usually carried over to the next god of death that touches it, but it is common sense that it is returned to the great god of death. Only by touching each other's death note can individuals who own the death note in the human world recognize the appearance and voice of each other's gods of death. That is part 1.